Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I am a faculty member at Northwestern University and the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It is really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Juan Llamas-Rodriguez is assistant professor in the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. Cristal Camargo, a doctoral student at Northwestern and an affiliate of the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Juan in just a minute. I am delighted to note that this quarter our series is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Communication Studies, the Department of Radio, Television, and Film, and the program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. But before we go to the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly a little bit more about how the seminar will unfold. First, Cristal will tell us more about Juan's research and career in just a minute. Then Juan will present his work. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar. Cristal will moderate. The Q&A function is at the bottom of your screen. You can enter your questions at any point in time, and we'll read them after Juan finishes his presentation. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us. And Cristal, now the screen is all yours.
Hi, thank you, Pablo, for that kind introduction and for the opportunity to introduce today's guest speaker. Dr. Juan Llamas-Rodriguez is an assistant professor at Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. Previously, he was an assistant professor of critical media studies at the University of Texas at Dallas, where he served on the faculty advisory board for the Center of U.S. Latin America Initiatives. Situated at the intersections of global media cultures, digital technologies, border studies, infrastructure studies, and Latin American media, Dr. Llamas-Rodriguez's research mobilizes media and communication theories to critically analyze borders, migration, and related social dynamics on a global scale. In addition, he focuses on cultural approaches to digital and interactive media from Latin America and by Latinx diasporic communities. His forthcoming monograph out this coming fall, titled Border Tunnels, examines how media form and technologies shape perceptions about the border and help reimagine border-making practices stakes. Dr. Llamas-Rodriguez's second book, part of the queer film classic series at McGill's Queen's University Press, analyzes the legacy, popularity, and queer significance of the Mexican film Y Tu Mamá También. He also regularly writes about the intersectionality of race, class, and gender politics of Netflix's Spanish language programming. His work has appeared in the journals Feminist Media Histories, Television and New Media, Lateral, Film Quarterly, Jump Cut, and the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies, as well as several collections. Dr. Llamas-Rodriguez is the co-editor of In Transition Journal of Videographic Film and Moving Image Studies, the first peer-reviewed open access academic journal of videographic scholarship, and is the recent associate editor of Outreach and Equity for the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies. In addition, he actively engages in public humanities projects as a Global Internet TV Consortium member and a host of the Global Media Cultures podcast. In today's seminar series titled Playing the Game of Migration, Dr. Llamas-Rodriguez takes us into the world of educational and news games that claim to depict what's it like to be a migrant fleeing hardships and the journey into a new country. In this presentation, he interrogates those claims and places them within a larger conversation to understand the standardizations of key migration issues and the public engagement of said issues. Without further ado, Dr. Llamas-Rodriguez.
All right, thank you so much, Crystal, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to Pablo, Facundo, and all the folks at the Center for Latinx Digital Media for having me here. I'm going to share my screen. You can see my slides. All right, so today I want to talk to you about games. The metaphor of the game has often used as an ironic descriptor of the trials and risks that people on the move take to reach their destinations, as well as the strategies to navigate and exploit the unequal immigration systems of countries in the global north. This metaphor has some explanatory purchase. When you map out the draconian system of paperwork involved in the US-Mexico immigration system, for instance, with its loopholes, unnecessary complications, and variable wait times, not to mention the interviews that feel like the final boss battle in a platform game, these do end up looking a lot like the outline of a game just waiting to be coded. In this presentation, I want to take the stickiness of this metaphor as symptomatic of the resonances between the structure of games and the standardization, organization, and management of migration issues. Following Alinda Chang's proposal that we consider how games blend real worlds with fictional rules, I propose that the artificial construction of playable models offered by digital games serve as unique opportunities to try out, contest, and critically reevaluate the real-life politics of migration. Games and other interactive fictions about the topic of migration tend to be of different kinds. You have the commercial kind, like Smuggle Truck, which use migrants or border iconography to sell their game or other related products. You have the sort of art intervention kind, like Vagamundo Migrant's Tale, which use game dynamics to create a short piece that invites participants to reflect on one aspect of the experience of immigrants. And you have the educational kind, in some ways the most common type, like Points of Entry or ICED, I can end deportation, ! Which aims to teach players specifically defined issues related to migration. But to be honest, I am not that concerned with these distinctions. For the past decade or so, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and other humanitarian agencies have regularly partnered with developers to create so-called serious or educational games, whose goals are to teach global North citizens about the plight of migrants. But as several scholars and commentators before me have already pointed out, these serious games are often not very good at teaching and often not very good games. So instead, in my project, I prefer to focus on critically analyzing how these games actually work rather than taking their creators' intentions at face value. My investment in and analysis of the games of migration departs from three central premises. One, games do not model what it is like to be a migrant. Might as well get that out of the way. This is a pervasive rhetorical flourish from the creators and promoters of games made by News Corps, humanitarian organizations, and other education-oriented groups. These games posit that their interactive narratives can put the users in the shoes of a migrant. Fundamentally, this is impossible. Through their digital affordances, interactive platforms, including games, that mediate between a migrant character and a non-migrant user are already maintaining this distinction in the process. The creation of difference is intrinsic to the process of intermediation. Presenting the game as an opportunity to play as a migrant solidifies the migrant story as an object that can be readily accessed by the game's intended user, in this case, the global North citizen. What these designers are attempting to do is to create empathy for the migrant presented through the interactive platform. This is also a problem. I'm not getting into the empathy argument today because several scholars have already mounted a very strong case against prioritizing empathy as the main mode of engagement with social issues. For just sample and against empathy, psychologist Paul Bloom argues that empathy may make us care here and now, but it, quote, leaves us insensitive to the long-term consequences of our acts, as well as to the suffering of those we do not or cannot empathize with, end quote. And of course, there are clear racial, class, and gender implications for empathy always relying on whether we feel like we can or cannot empathize with a specific subject. Designing for empathy means molding the experiences of migrants into victim narratives that users can readily consume. And Rebecca Hamlin has shown how this dynamic is so central to the UNHCR's media project. Refugees have to remain within a victim frame in order to appease wealthy donors and contributing nation states that would otherwise balk at the idea of granting rights to all sorts of migrants. So empathy is also always about appealing to the experiences of the person empathizing, obfuscating the situatedness of the person who is suffering. In short, empathy prioritizes the empathizer, not the object of empathy. Instead of striving for empathy, I think the kind of intellectual and effective work that I find compelling in thinking of migration issues through play can be better defined through the metaphor of visiting, wherein the user retains and remains conscious of their positionality while momentarily seeing from another's perspective. And I think this kind of dual positionality of always being conscious of the user's own position is crucial, given a second foundational premise. The ideal game player is a citizen. In her analysis of Vagamundo, A Migrant's Tale, Claire Taylor concludes that the game's success lies in how it upends digital games' usual equation of game progression with assimilation. The model player is not unlike the model citizen, given how both strive to assimilate in order to better interact with the game or with the world, in order to progress through different difficulty levels, and ultimately in order to win. I propose that this implicit set of assumptions undergirds all game design. Game dynamics thrive on the illusion of agency. The instantaneous reaction of the system to the player's inputs ideologically functions to sell interactivity as agency. If the model player gives in to the rules of the game, some economic, political, and social choices will always be open to them. The ideal player imagines themselves as having a right to be in the virtual world, a right to choices, and a right to prosper in it. The player is, in other words, always a citizen. It is important to recognize how this power dynamic shapes all games about migration. Although many of the examples that I look at include migrant subjects as avatars or as interlocutors for their citizen users, the modes of interaction facilitated by the platform effectively disavow the migrant status as a political subject by reifying all of their experiences into a controlled interactive experience. Whatever the narrative of the game, given the central dynamic, the citizen gets to play while the migrant gets played. 3, the lesson design is not always the lesson played. So because they attempt to selectively model a complex issue within a playable narrative, games about migration necessitate what Mary Flanagan calls critical play, to create or occupy play environments and activities through a careful examination of social, cultural, or political themes. The potential of critical play lies in its capacity to deconstruct and reconstruct social structures as an analog to interrogating the rules that govern a game. So this is why I'm not as concerned with the distinctions between games in terms of genre or intent, whether it's commercial, educational, artistic, or what have you. By engaging in critical play, all games about migration could have something to teach us about this topic and its politics. Yet these lessons cannot be located in the game exclusively. The disposition of the players towards its themes and its issues and the meta discussion surrounding them remains central. As Melissa Kagan has illustrated, in the case of border games, actually in particular, protest and resistant forms of play can also be reactionary. And so, for example, she cites the example of playthroughs of the Papers, Please game, where you play as a Border Patrol agent, where many YouTubers actually perform anti-migrant fantasies of just rejecting everyone and not allowing them into the country. So critical play may not be inherently progressive, but it does create openings for more sustained engagement with the social issues encountered in games. Hong and Wu suggest that we think of players as co-creators of knowledge, whose in-game activities can foster alternative perspectives on their social worlds and on themselves. The reflexive dialogue enabled by playing critically, so by thinking through the game's rules, are stand-ins for the norms that govern social structures, provide us with a generative opportunity for pedagogues and activists to draw attention to social issues in engaging ways. Now, to be clear, I'm not arguing here that playing migration games necessarily will offer a better sense of the sort of plights of people on the move or the issues of migration than something like a documentary, TV news report, or a television show might. However, games can better highlight specific aspects of these issues. Playable models are by design a pared-down version of their real-life counterparts. But because of that repetitive interactivity, these models can help us make sense of one specific aspect that they foreground. They really can sort of zero in and make that aspect the sort of central thing to examine and examine it in depth. At stake, then, is analyzing and deciphering the ways that these games use their interactive features to foreground a sort of operative facet, a specific characteristic within the interconnected web of issues that encompass the topic of migration. So although most games will do this, they'll claim that they're showing the migrant story very broadly. Once you examine the procedural dynamics of these games, you end up finding that they privilege one operative facet over all others. My intent is both to excavate this facet and to examine how successful or not the game depicts and enables critical reflections with it. So today, I will focus on two games in order to explain what I mean by excavating and examining these operative facets. Game one. The Migrant Trail is a computer game created by Gigantic Mechanics Studio as a companion to The Undocumented, a film by Marco Williams that focuses on the efforts to find the remains of dead migrants across the Sonoran Desert. The game was released free to play in 2013 on the website promoting the film, which also included an interactive visualization showing the sort of number of migrant deaths reported across the US-Mexico border. The visualization and the game function as promotions of the film and extensions of the stories presented therein. According to its creators, by integrating the characters, the stories, and the visuals from the film alongside an intense gameplay decisions, the Migrant Trail allows what they call, quote, more deeply experience and understand the human toll of our border policies, end quote. So the Migrant Trail starts by introducing you to a crossing party of 12 migrants and requires you to proceed through each of the characters in the crossing party in order. Each of the characters has different backstories, which the game turns into distinct difficulty levels. So a character's age or their backstory, if they had an injury or something, can add complications regarding how fast they can walk, how quickly they get exhausted, and so forth. To win the game, you have to get all characters across the desert and safely into the US by playing each one in turn. So every level of the game is crossing the desert with a different character. Once you play a character, their fate is sealed. So regardless of whether you made it to the other side or whether they died in the desert, the next level unlocks and you get to move on to the next character. So if at any of the levels your playable character dies, you essentially cannot win the game anymore unless you restart the entire party and replay all of them. Needless to say, this makes it very difficult to ever win the game. As you can see here, the game briefly introduces you to the real-life counterpart of the character you are about to play, noting their motivations for crossing and complementing the animated graphics of the game with select clips from the documentary. Once you've selected the character in each level, you have to equip them with clothing and supplies, which you buy at this vending stall out of a set budget of $100. Choosing your supplies represents a sort of cost-benefit analysis between having enough food, water, and medicines to maintain all of your stats, which you see there in the sort of upper left corner, as well as not overloading your backpack, which you see in the bottom left corner, because that will drain your physical strength faster. So once the level starts, your character automatically works with the rest of the crossing party at a steady pace. You don't have to do anything to keep them moving, but you do have to choose a direction wherever the party reaches a fork in the road. Instead, your main concern during the crossing is to keep your character alive by maintaining their 4 stats: hydration, energy, physical strength, and will. All of these stats are progressively drained as you walk through the desert at different speeds, depending on character, route conditions, and other decisions made along the way. Will, as you just saw, fluctuates depending on events that occur throughout the journey. Memories of loved ones replenish your character's will, while encountering dead bodies exhausts it. Hydration and energy can be exhausted with time and events, like having to go through treacherous terrain, and replenish with food and liquids from your backpack or from encountering a humanitarian worker. And physical strength can be exhausted with injuries, going through dangerous zones, and replenished with rest at night. So differentiating these stats are helpful to parse out the embodied and mental toll of crossing the desert. So 2 of these, hydration and energy, become constant concerns that you need to be attended to. And that's why most of what you pack on your backpack is food and water, fluids. While the other 2, physical strength and will, remain largely dependent on the conditions presented in the trail. These conditions are still somewhat within the player's control, given that they change based on which route you choose at any fork in the road, but the player does not really know that from the outset. So it ends up being, in some way, there is a level of chance there as well. As a game tied to a film about the uncounted and unacknowledged deaths of migrants, central to the contributions of the migrant trail is how it makes migrant death across the desert as an operative facet. How is death operationalized in the migrant trail? For contrast, let me first talk about another example, this game called Borders. In this game, the migrant character's death, either by lack of water or by being caught by a border patrol agent, also ends the level. In fact, Borders makes it so that death is the only way to end the level. In this one, when the border patrol agent catches you, he shoots you, so you immediately die. And this is in contrast to the migrant trail, where characters can be caught by border patrol, which ends the level, but then it sets the status of your character as arrested. But as you can see here, in Borders, as soon as the character dies, the level resets, and you can try the level again without any consequence. And that's because the game takes on the setting and the symbols of crossing the border, but does not change any of the dynamics of the maze action game to comment on these thematic concerns. It's kind of like Pac-Man if Pac-Man was a border crosser. Ultimately, the effect is the trivialization of migrant death, both because of the simplicity of its mechanics and because of the relative insignificance of the stakes. And to be fair, death in video games is a relatively simple and insignificant. For most narrative games, death is a mistake to undo, as a way to learn a lesson. The cost of game death is measured in time, but given an infinite number of retries, death is no more than a temporary setback. In response to these dominant design paradigms, a counter-design movement has arisen called permanent death or permadeath. Permadeath re-emphasizes the precariousness of play by making defeat, failure, and death irrevocable. And this can be programmed in a number of ways. So there are games that you can only play once, or that will lock you out of the server after your character dies, or avatars and entire levels will be deleted if you lose. Players may choose to do permadeath runs, where they play an entire game without ever saving their progress. Across all of these, in permadeath games, death is not a mistake to undo, but a way to make play consequential, meaningful, even thrilling. Now, the Migrant Trail is not a permadeath game, but there are some stakes in making death semi-permanent in the game. When you play a character and you lose, that is, they die, you, as the player, can move on to the next level and play as another character, but the fate of the dead character is sealed. They will remain dead unless you restart the entire game. You can finish the game when you go through all the characters' level, but it's not necessarily a win if you have arrived there by letting some people in the crossing party die in the process. This semi-permanent death encodes higher stakes in a character's death than the more traditional example of Borders that I just showed before, especially since the difficulty level rises with each character, and losing a later character, like when you lose the mother who's walking with her son or the old man, basically forces you to reset all the progress you have made thus far. The upward facet in the Migrant Trail are the conditions that lead to migrants' death while crossing the desert. And I think the game actually offers a pretty compelling model that explains several of the factors that contribute to migrants' death, both by disaggregating the character's life-death binary into the 4 stats, and by programming a series of events that complicate the choices needed to be made, both before the level in terms of what it is that you need to carry, and during it in order to maintain those stats. In the game as a whole, though, the stakes of death are emphasized through its semi-permanent death mechanism. However, when you look at the individual level, the maintenance of life and prevention of death is operationalized as a calculation of risk. There's a limited budget and space on what you can afford, and given such limitations, you have to choose between carrying items that will nourish, hydrate, or heal. At several points in the trail, you have to make a cost-benefit analysis between one stat at the expense of another. So if you go through a set of cacti, that's going to lower your physical strength, but if you walk around them to avoid them, that's going to lower your energy. And finally, you have to make decisions between individual and group survival. There are some gestures towards outside forces. So if you encounter a rancher, it'll tell you that Border Patrol has a higher detection radius. So you can choose to change the route that you take, or you can choose to go back. But all of that was going to spend more time and lower your resources. Overall, however, the calculation of mortality risk is presented as a set of individual choices. How much food versus water versus medicine you choose to carry, the route you choose to follow, and the decision to help a fellow border crosser or leave them behind. These series of individual choices represent the choices that migrants must take when crossing the Sonoran Desert. Yet by virtue of being figured as individual stories, the game cannot sort of fully convey the structural context for why these reasons are the only ones presented in the first place. Still, I think the Migrant Trail offers us a useful model for how migrants' precarity in the desert, but certainly in society at large, is always figured as an individual responsibility. By disaggregating the elements that impact a migrant's survival across 4 stats and across a myriad different events, the game also illustrates how the desert as an environment acts on migrants' life or death, simulating what border scholars have long argued are the necropolitical uses of the desert by Border Patrol. In their introduction to a special issue on this idea of permadeath games, game scholars Alinda Chang, Jesus Costantino, and Braxton Sutterman suggest that we interpret the rising interest in this mechanic as a symptom of our time. So they ask, could permadeath be linked to more intimate experiences of precarity in contemporary life? I want to suggest that the still inchoate attempts at encoding permadeath in the migrant trail offers us some way to think about how to more critically engage with the biopolitics as well as the politics of care that structure migrant crossing parties. Although the game's design choices betrayed that this is not their primary intention, one cannot help but realize while playing the game that it is not individual, but rather collective forms of care that are needed to withstand and to survive the precarious trails that migrants traverse. So I've said that games do not model what it is like to be a migrant, and this is most true in regards to death. No game could adequately convey the life and death consequences of undertaking a border crossing journey. In spite of this absence, death mechanics in games do influence how we think and behave within real death worlds, both as thrill and as tragedy. Struggling with how to raise the stakes of death in a playable model is a small, but perhaps ultimately consequential way to begin to ask, how do we raise the stakes of the precarity of migrants' lives and deaths in society at large? So that's game number one. Game number two is the waiting game. The waiting game is a news game created by ProPublica and Playmatics based on the real case files of 5 asylum seekers from 5 different countries. The stories presented in the game are based on journalist interviews and materials from the case officers, lawyers, and judges who are either directly involved with these cases or who attend to these cases kind of regularly. Although the identities of the asylum seekers are never shown in the game itself, each of the playable stories represents one of the 5 criteria for refugee status as defined under the 1951 UN Refugee Convention. So there's race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, and political opinion. The creators of the game traffic in the same kind of language that others have before them, stating that the waiting game lets you walk in the shoes of an asylum seeker. Needless to say, it does not. It does, however, make excellent use of its simple mechanic to give effective life to the anxiety and uncertainty of waiting. So you play the game in your browser window. The landing page gives you just sort of this brief introduction that it's too dangerous for you in your country. So for your safety, you leave behind and you head to the US. You are uncertain that you will be able to get there, and you're even less certain that you will be allowed to stay. It then asks you to select one of the 5 stories to play. Throughout the selected story, you are presented with a scene card. Each scene includes a title and some narrative description in a light gray font atop a black screen. The left side includes a black and white illustration that sort of broadly alludes to either the setting or a major development featured in the scene. And likewise, the soundtrack, which you can't hear right now, but the soundtrack consists of ambient noises gesturing towards the setting and the activities described in the scene. At each scene, the player is presented with 2 options, indicated by the 2 buttons on the bottom right corner: keep going or give up. Other than the option of muting the soundtrack, there are no other options for the entire duration of the game. At every scene, the player can choose to keep going or choose to give up. The scenes that the player encounters fall into 2 different types. Event scenes indicate a change of setting, so the character has proceeded in their journey, or a change of situation. So there's new developments on your asylum case, there's the birth of a child. These scenes are usually accompanied by changes in the soundtrack. So once you move into the detention center, the sounds of a sort of yard, a prison yard are heard as well. The event scenes are inspired by the real-life facts of the story on which the playable narrative is based. Detail scenes fill out the time between event scenes. So detail scenes paint a picture of the mundanity that structures the waiting for important events to occur. So there's comments about the weather, about eating, about caring for children or partners, and so forth. The number and descriptions of the detail scenes are randomly generated from a long list of possibilities, meaning that any 2 playthroughs through the same story could have a different order of scenes. It also means that the length of each story fall within a range rather than a defined limit. So every time you restart the game, it could be a little longer, it could be a little shorter. Sometimes a flashback scene appears on a white screen, which provides background information on your character situation. So you get to find out things that happened before you started the journey and how those impact the reason why you started the journey. So essentially for the entire game, you can keep doing this, click and keep going and moving on to the next scene. If you eventually decide to click on give up, you get to this scene where the screen tells you the number of days that you lasted. It compares that with an average number of days that players last in this story, as well as the expected total length of the story. And the expected total length is roughly based to how long it actually took the asylum seeker for their process to be approved. The scene also offers you the opportunity to share your progress on Twitter, learn more about asylum by reading an article, listen to a podcast. After this brief moment of shaming, you can continue to play in normal mode, watching event scenes and detail scenes like you have before, or now you have fast forward mode. In fast forward mode, you only move through the major events in the story. And it keeps, I don't know how much you can see because it's very small, but in the bottom right corner, right above the major events only button, you have a day counter. So you see how many days you're skipping at a time. And so you can avoid all the detail scenes and only move through the event scenes. And in the end, you get to this final screen, which says that you have made it through all the days, but with the red asterisk saying you did this with a little bit of cheating / fast forwarding. The waiting game belongs to a certain type of news game that seeks to borrow the format of the choose your own adventure in order to illustrate different aspects of the migrants' narratives being reported on. So for example, here's the refugee challenge, which was created by The Guardian and supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which invites you to make choices that real refugees have to make. And again, find out what it's really like to look for safety in Fortress Europe. Essentially, users are presented with one story in this case, that of Karima, a 28-year-old Sunni woman from Aleppo and mother of 2. And users can role-play Karima's decision to relocate from Syria to another country. Some choices lead you nowhere. So if you opt to go to Europe by air, you learn that you can't do that because you don't have a visa. So you select to go by land. You may be unable to go through one route, so you try again, select another, so forth. There are several possible endings to this interactive story depending on the choices you make along the way. So you can settle into a refugee camp in Turkey, you can be detained in a Greek detention center, or you can get stuck in Italy living in a squat, or you can reach Stockholm and claim asylum. At the end, the interactive narrative tells you the journey you have just been on is only one of many trod every day by refugees fleeing war and famine. When their journey is over, they, of course, do not have the luxury of starting again to see how things could have worked out differently. But if you would like to, you can start again using the button below. The goal of the refugee challenge is for users to try out as many combinations of choices as possible in order to get a sense of all the different possible outcomes. By coding these choices as ones that lead to favorable and unfavorable outcomes, however, this interactive narrative implicitly suggests that there are good choices and there are bad choices, but doesn't really elaborate on how the risks contained in the good ones can make the bad ones seem more appealing before the fact. And although there are verbal references to the state policies and the social realities impacting the asylum seeker's journey, the constant refrain of "you have new choices" centers the weight of responsibility on the migrant character. Now, to be fair, the entire premise of interactive narratives like games is to give the players choices and to simulate the consequences of players' decisions. But it's this oceanic gap between how the process of choice, decision, consequence functions for a real-life migrant versus how this process functions for a citizen user is why these choose-your-own-adventure migration games always end up articulating unsatisfying reductions of the stories they tell. Instead, the waiting game simplifies and in some way perverts the choose-your-own-adventure format by limiting the choices to keep going or give up. The user does not get to try out a number of different options to find out which one leads to the best outcome. Such a situation would imply that we as the citizen user will know better and will make better choices than the migrant characters. Choose Your Own Adventure games suggest that users' choices have meaningful impact in the fictional world, despite what we know is the programmed limited list of possible outcomes. The waiting game belies this illusion of meaningful choices leading to transformative change. In the option between keep going or give up, all you can do is endure. How long can you last before you give up? This last line of the introductory screen for the waiting game offers us its simple yet revelatory purpose. There's not much to do in the game except wait. The otherwise uncomplicated mechanisms of clicking, reading, and clicking again bring before the central, albeit unremarked aspect of the migrant experience. As border study scholars argue, a border can be considered a waiting act because it causes a standstill, a difference in time and space. There's waiting for that final border as one goes through wait periods, prolonged processing times, and uncertain timelines to be inducted via visas, permits, or residency cards. Even for those that can provide all their documentation, different temporalities of waiting produce subjectivities at borders. So citizens get global entry and automated document checks, while suspect migrants are questioned and prodded and shepherded through secondary inspections and perhaps held indefinitely. To be an immigrant in America is to wait, writes Molly Crabapple. The immigrant experience is laden with moments of waiting, even beyond the purported side of the border. These moments are often suffused with perpetual anxiety. The displacement of waiting manifests not only temporally, but also ontologically. Waiting creates a temporal schema that destabilizes the certainty of being. Indeed, so many of the detailed scenes in the waiting game are mundane activities, and sometimes repeated ones because it's just algorithmically created, so sometimes you'll get the same screen twice. Clicking through one screen only to get to another screen just like it is reminiscent of the ever-present clicking refresh on an immigration application. Time goes by and you're still stuck in the same situation with no meaningful change in your status. Now, the game is still a computational model for this waiting, so players get to choose how long they spend on each scene. Reading a scene at a normal rate can take between 8 to 15 seconds, but players may spend longer if they want to understand everything that's in it or they decide to Google something. If they don't read the scenes and they just power through with clicks, players can spend as little as half a second on each simulated day. In this manufactured moment of waiting, it is the uncertainty rather than the length of the wait that must be considered in depth. The shortest story that you can choose is around 600 days or 40 minutes in real time, while the longest can be almost 2,100 days or 140 minutes of real time. Players do not know that stories have different lengths or even what those lengths are. And although sitting for 1 to 2 hours are not tantamount to waiting for asylum for years, and certainly not indicative of the conditions in which migrants live while they're waiting, the game manages to replicate a specific sense of mental and physical unease by only presenting the options to keep going or to give up, without any reference to how long one must continue to keep going in order to make it through. The waiting game is a test of endurance, certainly. But it is also unwittingly a rebuke against the strive for empathy across many immigration games. Although the creators do refer to the sort of usual walk in a migrant's shoes rhetoric, the design of the game actually succeeds in mobilizing its computational modeling to force the player to reflect on their own position as a citizen user, in contradistinction to the migrant character whose shoes they supposedly wear. And few players sit through an entire story level in normal mode, but many do choose to proceed in fast forward mode after giving up. The desire to know how the story ends, to get to the happy ending, is indicative of the packaged experience that many interactive migrant stories promise. But the game reminds players that they're able to get to this happy ending because of their cheating, because the player as a citizen user is afforded the privilege of fast forwarding, of cutting the line, of getting the global entry of gameplay. The player using fast forwarding may have finished the game, but this red asterisk at the end indicts them for not being able to subject themselves to this already very shortened version of the anxiety of waiting. You only had to wait 40 minutes instead of years and years. How can one even pretend to want to learn what it is like to be a migrant when the discomfort of sitting and clicking for an hour or so is already too burdensome? So I want to conclude with one last premise, or rather a proposition that synthesizes my three initial ones. Games can meaningfully contribute to the public discourse about migration if we reframe our expectations. Humanitarian organizations, news groups, activists, and other very well-intentioned game makers tend to overestimate and overpromise the impact of their creations in relation to the social issues engaged. The game puts you in the migrant's shoes. The game covers the entirety of the migrant story. The game in itself is the key to long-lasting social change. These promises are not only broad, but also unfocused. We need more nuanced and more targeted approaches to how and when games can serve as instigators of public engagement. As blends of real-world situations with fictional rules, digital games provide us with unique opportunities to isolate specific characteristics and contentious issues surrounding the topic of migration. The waiting game in its simplicity foregrounds the anxiety and bodily unease that the uncertainty of waiting produces for subjects whose futures remain undecided. The migrant trail fails to fully flesh out its model of migrant death in the desert, but here even its failures are instructive too. If we approach them through critical play, these games allow us to test out, reflect on, and reevaluate the real-life implications of these characteristics or issues. And in that way, playing the game of migration becomes not only a metaphor, but also a call to action. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Llamas-Rodriguez, for that amazing presentation. I have so many different thoughts and questions, and it's really interesting to see these dynamics in a game. We're going to now start the Q&A portion of this seminar. If you have a question, feel free to put it into the chat and I will read it out loud to our guest. I'm going to start us off just out of curiosity. This kind of reminded me of other forms of, I guess, maybe not games, but journeys that try to depict the same thing, whether it's like Alejandro Ruto's like Carne y Arena museum exhibit, or like also when you go to a Holocaust museum and they give you like headphones and you kind of go through the journey. And in both of those situations, I'm kind of left like wondering what's the role of language, because often when a migrant goes from one place to another, like they're likely not to know the language, right? And I was wondering if these games incorporate any type of like linguistic diversity or multilingualism, or have like subtitles or any type of things to kind of accomplish or try to replicate that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, they don't. I remember the waiting game was attempted to be, because it's a news game, they were attempting to translate it. I don't know if they have yet, but Migrant Trail does not. It does. I think, as Olivia points out, there's one of the items is a suero, so it does say it in Spanish, right? But it's kind of just like those kind of visual accents, right, or extras. But no, the narrative and all of the playthrough is in English. And part of it, I read that as it goes back to assuming that the player for these games is going to be the sort of the global North citizen, right? This is going to be for someone whose either first language or competencies in English are pretty high, right? So even in the design of the game, you can start to see how it is implied that you're hoping that this person is going to be, Anglo, or at least English speaking, and it's going to come from like specific kind of groups as well. Yeah, so I haven't really seen as much translation, especially in these two games, and certainly others that use very little language as well. So you see borders doesn't even really explain its rules. It's just like you plops you in there and then you're trying to make it to the other side, right?
That's super fascinating because often when you don't know a language and you're being thrown in these situations, your anxiety is probably most likely to go through the roof. So it's really interesting to see how they envision that linguistic audience member. We have a question here from Sara Hinojosa, who says, not sure if you focus on audience, the players, but do you know the demographics of these players and who are playing these games?
Yes and no. So on the one hand, I don't know like who the empirical audience are for these games. I think for the most part, my analysis is focusing on the sort of design of the games, right, and doing the reading through the text in and of itself. I will say I love using the waiting game to in classes. So students react very strongly to the waiting game, especially when it is framed as an assignment, and so they have to do it. And that in the sort of small set that represents the different reactions to what the game is offering and what it isn't offering is always very illustrative in terms of thinking about students who found it frustrating and therefore uninteresting, students who found it really frustrating but interesting because of that frustration, sort of buying into, I guess, the argument that I'm trying to make about the game. But then also students who did not like it or are sort of acting up against it because it's so simple. Because of this idea that there has to be more complexity. I use the refugee challenge as sort of a contrast to the waiting game because it's kind of what we've been expected, right? There's like, well, you know, it's really boring that you only can keep going or give up, or you want certain choices. You get a lawyer's phone number. I wanted the button to like call the lawyer now immediately, right? So this assumption that the sort of citizen user is like, well, we need choices and we need to make these things is in some ways, it's something that you could program, assuming, but again, would be catered to the user themselves, as opposed to letting them dwell and think about like, why would this person not have called the new lawyer immediately, right? Why would they sit on that and try and see if their first lawyer did something, and then only after you realize that they didn't, then you move on, right? Like that sort of anxiety or nervousness is not really focused on. So I'm in thinking about the sort of demographics of the players. I think the waiting game definitely had a bigger reach because it was produced by ProPublica and won a number of sort of news games awards in that sense. And in some ways, it's an easier game to get into, right? But I don't have the sort of detailed demographics of that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for answering that. We're going to continue. This is from AJ Christian. He says, thank you for a fascinating talk. I learned a lot. How do you think the limits of representing borders differ in games versus TV/film narratives? It seems that despite limitations, these are themes and games that can be explored that are harder in film and TV, but that film and TV might ultimately be better at visiting migrant narratives. And there's a little bit more that says, on the question of death, I wonder how games completion affects these games and games in general. For what I heard, most people do not finish the games, particularly difficult mainstream ones, suggesting death actually does have consequence in general gameplay.
Yes. So I think the question of comparing what games offer versus something like film and TV narratives is a very helpful one. Because one of the things that, I guess, as whose background was in film and TV studies, or who is in film and TV studies, one of the things that I sort of balk against is the promotion of most of these games falls into some version of like, well, these are interactive and therefore they are better, or they're more immersive, or they're going to be more like have a bigger effect. And that's not necessarily true, right? And in fact, the fact that they're interactive, they're forcing the player to create some inputs could lead to falling down the sort of immersiveness that you could have when we have a sort of very effective film or documentary or something of that sort. So I think part of my interest in looking through these kinds of games is what are the things that they can't do, right, by requiring the sort of player interactivity that a narrative that sort of goes on its own wouldn't, right? So for example, there is a way you can talk about waiting in the same, like having, I don't know, like a 5-hour film about a person just sitting there waiting for their immigration, right? But it would require a different kind of involvement from the person as opposed to just forcing them to click, right? And the game won't move forward unless you click. So you won't know what happens until you click. But then when you click and nothing happens, the frustration sort of keeps building up, right? So I think that's a very effective use of that specific mechanic. And it's something that you use with interactive platforms that you might not be using in things that are audiovisual only in that sense. Yeah, in terms of the question of death, yeah, so I guess that is a good point in terms of thinking about death preventing completion, right? In terms of that frustration as well. I think that's why I'm like, well, it's not exactly it's not a permadeath mechanic in a more strict sense of other games that do that. But I think what I find fascinating in the Migrant Trail is that it really makes it very difficult for your entire crossing party to make it, right? So even if you don't make it through, and I'll be perfectly honest, I've not made it through all the characters, but even if you can't make it through, the part of critical play where you're reflecting on what you can and can't do and what is that affecting how you're thinking about these issues is helpful in that sense, right? Is how you think about death becomes consequential, not because it has the sort of same material change that death in the real world does, but it does get you to think about that impossibility, right? Of assuming that a crossing party of here of only 12 can't all make it because of all of these different characteristics, gets you to reflect on that more deeply.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Olivia's question was very similar to mine, which was talking about languages. And I felt like you kind of answered that. Her question just had to do with like translation and the word suero. So I'm actually going to ask Vale. Vale has a question. And I think she is going to unmute herself for this one, if I'm correct.
Sure.
Yes, thank you so much for such an interesting presentation, Professor Llamas-Rodriguez. I'm really intrigued by the procedural dynamics that highlight specific migration issues, as you highlighted in your presentation. So I'm wondering, how do the push to appeal to users through this design procedure and assimilation across socio-demographic factors really shape that idea of like winning the migration game within larger social spheres? Thank you so much.
So if I understand the question correctly, it has to do with how does like framing these as a game as well also affect the sort of migration or migrant like activities in the real world as thought of them as games as well? Is that right?
Yes, exactly. And as you mentioned, like just the different definitions of winning the game was death or crossing the border, or, you know, where does the game end? Like, how does that really shape how we generally understand migration across different populations, right? And across different sociodemographic groups. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. So two things I would say to that. So one is and I'm trying to theorize this distinction between the sort of user of the game as a citizen user versus the migrant as always played, right? Because all of these games, some of them do make it explicit. They're about asylum seekers, right? They call them refugees, but essentially it's asylum seekers. And even the ones that don't, that just say they're migrants generally, they're focused very specifically on a sector of migrant populations that don't have the rights, right? Don't have the opportunity to apply through quote unquote legal, but actually just like bureaucratically complex ways and so forth. So that seems to be the story that is most told, and that seems to be the one that appeals the most. Under this presumption that we don't know what that's like, we being the sort of global North citizen, right? And so we need the platform in order to even know about what that's like. But I think to go to an earlier point, you can know about that by just watching a documentary about this, right? Of which now there are dozens and dozens. So what is it that the game is telling you that you couldn't have already learned in these other ways? I will say, I only briefly mentioned it, but Claire Taylor has a really good already analysis of Vagamundo, Migrant Trail, which is essentially like an art game, but it's only in 3 levels. And so it works through different migrant stereotypes, and progressing through the levels, the migrant character becomes more assimilated. So like speaks more words in English, starts to dress differently. And if once you get to the game, you unlock a level where you can choose, oh, now you've made it, now you're part of the country, now you can become a border patrol agent. Do you want to, yes or not? And if you say yes, you unlock the level where you then become a border patrol agent. So it really drives down that assimilation narrative of saying, like, when you've won the game is when you crossed over to the citizen category, and now your role is to prevent others from getting to that category as well. And so I think that's a fascinating critique there of progression as assimilation.
Thank you so much.
I know we're running a little bit out of time, but there's one more question that I was hoping we could answer. Eduardo Gonzalez says, thank you for your talk. Building upon Sarah's question, what is the monetary cost associated with these games? I'm wondering how that contributes to questions of audience distribution and reception.
Yeah, great question. So I would say most of the games are free to play. Even there's something like Path Out, which is distributed through Steam, and you do pay something for it, but now they've, in collaboration with UNHCR, they've released an educational version, which is free to play. So most of these games will not cost you money to play. And I think that's because part of this, like, say, humanitarian events, right? We want people to have much access to them. You need a computer, right, in terms of being able to access them. I would say the main issue in terms of access is a lot of these games, which were produced between, say, like 2012 and 2015, were made in Flash, Adobe Flash, which is no longer supported, which means that the games are no longer immediately available. So most of these Migrant Trail I started playing after Flash was discontinued, but there are initiatives like Flashpoint that is doing emulators of Flash games. There are plugins like, I forget what it's called, but there's a plugin for the Chrome where you can suddenly play old. But for, let's say, the lay audience, in terms of access and distribution, that is one of the big things preventing them, that a lot of these games are just not accessible in that way anymore.
All right, thank you, Juan. That was a fascinating seminar. Great questions from the audience and great attendance. So thank you very much who joined us today for your participation and your questions. Thank you, Crystal, for, as always, excellent moderation. Juan, this was a phenomenal seminar once again, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sharing your work with us, and I invite everybody to join us for next week's seminar of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Once again, muchas gracias, Juan.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure.